The cloud.
Okay.
Okay.
All right. So as we were talking about spotlighting your interpreters, and if you click on the three dots in the upper right corner of the interpreter's video and choose pin, you'll have the interpreter the whole time. If you would like captions, you can activate them by clicking the CC icon at the bottom of your Zoom screen, or you can use the stream text link provided in the chat box. We're going to have questions and answers at the end of the presentation. So if you have questions during the presentation, please just type them in the chat box and we'll monitor them and ask them at the end. When we start the question and answer segment, we are going to turn off the recording. We're just recording the presentation itself. And so now I would like to introduce Karen Brim to you. And Karen, well, it's a wonderful bio here. Karen is the Interpreter Program Manager at the Virginia Department for the Deaf and Hard of Hearing, overseeing the Virginia Quality Assurance Screening and Interpreter Service Coordination for state agencies and the Virginia court system. Originally from Maryland, Karen holds a Master's of Arts in Interpreting Studies and Communication Equity from St. Catherine University and is an associate professor at Reynolds Community College in the Interpreter Education Program. Prior to joining VDDHH, she was an educational and staff interpreter for a public school system and published research on collaboration in K-12 interpreting. She is VDDHH's liaison to the Virginia Department of Emergency Management, VDEM, and from March of 2020 to March of 2022, she served as VDEM's Access and Functional Needs Officer, providing accessibility guidance to the Unified Command during Virginia's COVID-19 pandemic response. In 2020, she earned a Governor's Honor Award for Diversity, Inclusion, and Outreach as a member of the Equity Leadership Task Force. And so with that, Karen, it's over to you. Welcome.
Thank you so much, Bonnie. That was a mouthful. I really appreciate the welcome. And thank you all for joining tonight. Hopefully you're all warm and safe where you are. It's raining where I am, so really glad to be joining you on this rainy evening. Wanted to make sure before we really get started that everyone has a moment to be able to make sure that I am spotlit and the interpreter is spotlit and pinned, and we can get sort of an indication from the audience that everyone is able to see and properly pin the video and audio however you would like. Give everybody a moment to do that. While we wait for that for just a second, I want to just apologize in advance if my cat decides to visit and make a supervisory visit to make sure that everything is all right. Usually if she hears me making a presentation, she comes to check on me. That's just sort of one of the pitfalls of doing Zoom from home. So without further ado, we'll go ahead and get started. Hopefully everyone has had the chance to set up their video and audio. The presentation tonight is going to be centered around giving information about sign language interpreters and interpreting in the state of Virginia. Hopefully you'll leave tonight having learned something about interpreting that you maybe didn't know, or it could be a little bit of a refresher for you. I'm going to try and give everyone a chance to take a look at the slides before I start to speak about the content of each slide as we go along. And I also want to say that my slides will have a little bit of word content on them, probably more so than what is normally recommended for a PowerPoint slide. But I also wanted to make sure that if anyone in the audience wanted to get a copy of the PowerPoint slide after I'm finished, that you would be able to then have full information if you wanted to go back and look at it after the presentation is finished. So hopefully after I'm done, it will become a resource for you as well. Okay, so go ahead and hopefully my slides will advance properly. There we go. Give you a little bit of information about VDDHH itself. My agency is a state agency, and we have various programs that we offer throughout the state. My program is interpreter services, and then we also have community services that offers education and training, various topics that have to do with hearing loss, deaf culture, and outreach into the community. We also have a technology assistance program that provides technical assistance and equipment distribution for assistive technology for people who are deaf, hard hearing, deaf blind. And we also have Virginia Relay, which offers traditional relay services, which includes TTYs, voice carryover, and what have you throughout the state. So just to give you a little bit of an indication as to what we do generally as an agency. Yeah. And as far as interpreter services are concerned, we do primarily focus on interpreting, but we do also offer coordination for CART services, which is caption services that are done by a live captioner. And so most of our coordination focuses on state agencies and the court systems. And then we offer information and referral to private businesses and consumers who call us for information. Basically, a lot of the information that I'm going to be giving out to you all tonight. So this evening, I'm going to hopefully be able to answer some questions for you that you might have about what a qualified interpreter might bring to an interaction. What is a qualified interpreter? And what the interpreting profession in Virginia generally looks like. Give you information and resources about finding or asking for an interpreter in various settings, including the court system, maybe a DMV visit, the public school system, and other settings out in the community. And then maybe some best practices and tips for working with sign language interpreters. And then hopefully we'll have enough time for question and answer at the very end. So you may have heard the term qualified interpreter, and a lot of times people will ask, well, what does that mean? The Americans with Disabilities Act defines a qualified interpreter as someone who's able to interpret effectively and accurately, be an impartial person, so a neutral party who can interpret receptively, meaning that they can take in the message and understand the message that they're taking in, and that they can express that message in the second language that they're working into, so that those two parties can communicate with each other. These two parties don't have the same language. And so the interpreter is that person in between who knows both languages and is able to communicate that message back and forth. So there is unfortunately no hard and fast, no exact definition of what a particularly qualified interpreter is in every particular setting. So that means that a person who is qualified for one particular assignment may not be qualified for another particular assignment. And an interpreter who is appropriate to work with one consumer might not be the best fit for another particular consumer. So the challenge is for people who schedule interpreters and for people who work with deaf and hard of hearing consumers, for them to try to always be working toward effective communication, right? And so for everyone involved to always be consulting with each other and collaborating with each other to maintain that effective communication connection. That's in a perfect world. Obviously, that's our goal, is for there to always be effective communication and for everyone to always have a qualified interpreter. So there are various kinds of interpreters. You might hear different terminology used to describe an interpreter. Sign language interpreters typically work from English, spoken English, or written English, for instance, into American Sign Language or a signed message. Sometimes there is a form of signed message that is heavily influenced by English grammar and syntax. And so it's not pure ASL. And so a sign language interpreter is going to try and match the language use of the consumer that they are working with. But generally speaking, sign language interpreters in the United States work with American Sign Language and English as their language pair, the two languages that they work with. But there are also deaf interpreters. A lot of times that can be either a deaf interpreter who is working towards certification or a deaf interpreter who has attained certification. So those are often called CDIs, or certified deaf interpreters. And CDIs often work paired with a hearing interpreter. And CDIs are able to be a facilitator in order to take in a signed message and even more accurately match the language use of a deaf consumer. So sign language interpreters can be hearing, they can be deaf, they can work in pairs, they can also work in teams of 3, they can work over the course of a very long assignment. You might have multiple teams of interpreters. Interpreters can work on site physically in the same location as the consumers who have requested their services. They can work virtually, like we have our interpreters working with us this evening through video connection. Tonight, we're working with interpreters who are getting the message through a video conferencing platform. We're using Zoom this evening, but whenever you place a telephone call, you are using a video relay interpreter, which is a different platform that's regulated through telecommunications regulations. So there are various ways that you might be connected with an interpreter or collaborate with and work with an interpreter. And even virtually, you might have teams of interpreters, multiple interpreters working together. So all of that is based on the setting, the length of the assignment, the type of material that is being presented, how technical it is, how complex it is. So every assignment has to be evaluated, every request has to be evaluated for what the best coverage, interpreter coverage is for that, so that, again, we're working toward the most effective communication for that assignment. Give you a second to sort of look over some of these bullets, and then I'll elaborate on some of them. Okay, so how does interpreting in Virginia work, especially as opposed to other places? Interpreting generally as a profession is a profession that requires training and experience before an interpreter is considered proficient and has attained a level of skill that allows them to be able to provide effective communication to consumers. So interpreter trainees who have just started out in their education would ideally not be put into a situation where they are interpreting for consumers by themselves. They should have support and mentoring during their training period so that they are able to improve their skills and be able to develop their ability to work effectively with consumers and manage the interpreting tasks that they're asked to perform. Professional interpreters are paid for their services, and they generally work at an hourly rate. They can be freelancers who work for themselves as basically small business owners who set their own rates, they make their own invoices, they pay their own taxes, that sort of thing. Or those interpreters can maybe sign up for work through an interpreter referral agency, where the agency receives requests from the consumers out in the community, and the freelancer works through those agencies, and the agency helps them with the paperwork, and the agency does the invoicing and that sort of thing. So you, as a consumer of interpreter services, might directly hire the interpreter and pay them yourself, or you might hire them through an interpreter referral agency. Generally speaking, businesses are the ones that will hire and pay for the interpreters. There are a few situations where the deaf consumer would hire the interpreter and pay for them themselves. Usually that is for something that is a small private family affair, like a family wedding, for example. But for many, many other types of interactions, doctor's appointment, funerals, school interactions, dentist appointments, job interviews, job coaching, all of those types of settings, the business is the entity that's responsible for getting the interpreter. And so those businesses need to be familiar with how to hire an interpreter. Okay? Interpreters don't generally work on for free, although some interpreters do volunteer for causes that are important to them or offer their services on a pro bono basis if it's something that they feel very strongly about, or say if it's a church that they have affiliated themselves with and decided that they want to provide services there for free as part of their service to that church, for example. But generally speaking, that type of volunteer or pro bono service would be agreed upon ahead of time so that all the parties would be aware of that. So a business would not ever want to assume that an interpreter would be providing services for free. Usually service agreements or terms of service are worked out ahead of time before an interpreter would provide the services. Again, sign language interpreters might work alone, but there are times when interpreters would say, this assignment warrants bringing in a second interpreter because of the length of the assignment or because of the complexity of the materials that would be discussed during this assignment. And so each request would kind of be evaluated to see how many interpreters would be needed for it. In Virginia, there is no license requirement and there is no registration regulation. There have been a couple of efforts over the last 10 to 15 years to investigate and institute a licensure or regulation requirement. That is a very long, complex process that has to go through several layers of regulatory review and approval. That has not been granted so far. And so at this point, there is no regulation in Virginia. However, there is a definition of what a qualified interpreter is in the state of Virginia. And so our regulation, or our Code of Virginia, does describe what is considered a qualified interpreter in the state of Virginia. Interpreters might be screened or nationally certified in Virginia in order to be able to, for instance, be listed in our directory of qualified interpreters. So I wanted to give you some pointers tonight about how to find interpreters for particular types of interactions. So let me give you a chance to be able to look at this slide, because I wanted to go over some tips, particularly to how to get interpreters for visits to the Department of Motor Vehicles. So when it comes to the DMV, we get a lot of questions and requests. And so I thought this would be a great opportunity for me to be able to give some general information and get that out into the community to clarify how we can assist in being able to get an interpreter for visits to the DMV for testing, but also just for general paperwork visits. The Department of Motor Vehicles, has various what they call customer service locations around the state. And so each customer service location, of course, has its own staff. And that's a very complex system. We know that a visit to the DMV can sometimes be visits that take quite a long time. They can involve a lot of paperwork, and staff at the DMV varies from people who have worked there for many years all the way to people who have just started, right? And so sometimes the staff is not aware of various processes of how things work, unfortunately. So we have made an agreement with the DMV that people who need sign language interpreting services are able to directly contact the my department, the Department for the Deaf and Hard of Hearing, in order to let us know that they need interpreting services for a Department of Motor Vehicles appointment. And we can proactively reach out and let that particular DMV location know that an interpreter is needed. We can coordinate the interpreter for that visit, and then it makes it a little bit easier for the that interaction to be more successful. Now, in the reverse, if you as a consumer have made an appointment, say on their online registration system, and you have an appointment email that you've got that has booked you for a certain day and time to go and renew your driver's license, for example, you can send us a copy of that email so that that has all of your appointment information on it. And we can use that to help us to be able to know when your appointment is and try and find an interpreter who might be available for that visit. So I guess my main point of this is, if you have an appointment for the DMV, you can reach out to us. You can email us at our delegated email address that's listed on this slide, which is ISP, that stands for Interpreter Services Program, at vddhh.virginia.gov, and give us as much information as you can. We would need to know your name, the location that you want to go to, what your appointment is for, when it is, and preferably as much advance notice as you can possibly give us. If you can give us alternate dates, say you give us, that you are flexible in what day you might be able to be available, that will help us to find an interpreter who is available to cover the assignment for you. And so we can work with you to try and find an interpreter who's available to go and cover that. We don't have interpreters on staff at VDDHH. And so we have to find an interpreter who is available and willing to cover that assignment. And that means sometimes we're not able to find someone who is available for that exact day and time in that location. And so we might come back to you and say, do you have a different day or time you might be able to move this appointment to? Unfortunately, sometimes we have to, ask you to give us an alternate date and time. But we do try our very best to be able to find an interpreter who can cover at the time that you would prefer, clearly. The DMV does have a knowledge test for the driving test that is an ASL recorded that is available to deaf and hard of hearing consumers who use sign language. Of course, it is not a one size fits all. And you are not required to use the recorded ASL version of the knowledge test. You are allowed to ask for a live interpreter to translate that test for you into sign language. If you go for the driving test, the interpreter is only allowed to be with you during certain portions, and they're not allowed to get into the car with you for the driving test. So there are certain rules that are involved with having the interpreter there for you, especially for the driving test portion. But we can go over that with you. And again, you are able to reach out to VDDHH. Now, there's a QR code here on the slide. And so if you want to snap that QR code on your camera, that will take you to the ability to download a flyer that we have made that has full information for you and has the email address and various hyperlinks on it that might be helpful to you. Okay, so if you use that QR code, it will let you download a PDF that we have available to you as a consumer that is informational for you. Okay. So the next setting I want to review with you is regarding court visits. I'll give you just a second to take a look at this slide before I start talking about it. So VDDHH has an agreement with the Supreme Court of Virginia. And the Supreme Court of Virginia's Office of the Executive Secretary basically kind of has, I don't want to say control exactly, but they kind of have an oversight over the various levels of the court system where accommodations are concerned. And so we have a memorandum with them, an agreement that VDDHH will coordinate interpreters for deaf and hard of hearing consumers who use sign language or CART services in order to have effective communication. So the way that works is that if you are a deaf and hard of hearing consumer who uses sign language or CART, and you, for example, get a ticket, unfortunately, you're speeding, you get caught speeding and you're pulled over, you get a ticket, and the policeman hands you a piece of paper. And at the top, it tells you the county that you've been cited in, and it tells you the court that they're going to ask you to appear in, and the date and the time of your court appearance. And you've decided that you're going to go ahead and go to court. What you would do is contact the clerk for the court that you've been asked to appear in. So you would need to go online, or if there's a phone number to call on your ticket, maybe on the back, or you go on the website for that court, and you would find the phone number for the clerk of the court. And you would call them and let them know that you are requesting an interpreter for that court date. And that clerk would then fill out a form with all of your court appearance information on it, and they'd send that form to my office. And then my office will search out an interpreter to appear for your court date. Okay, so unfortunately, we're not able to have you call us directly and say, oh my gosh, I got a ticket, I need to be in court, get me an interpreter. We have to get the form from the clerk of the court or from a court-appointed attorney, not a private attorney, court-appointed attorney, or from a judge or a magistrate. Someone from the court system has to give us that form in order to allow us permission to then go find an interpreter to cover that court hearing. Okay, so if I can emphasize one thing, is that if you need an interpreter to appear for court, maybe it's a hearing for your ticket, maybe it's a divorce hearing, maybe you need to go to the window and talk to the person where you're going to file your estate paperwork, and you need to make an appointment ahead to do that. For any of those things, you're going to let the clerk of the court know that you need an interpreter. And that clerk will fill out a form and let my office know to search for an interpreter for you. Okay. They'll need to know the case number. They'll need to know your name. As much information as you can give that clerk. They might even have a form for you to fill out so that they make sure that they're getting an interpreter for the right person. Now, say you're not the person who got a ticket. Maybe your son is 17 years old and he just got his first car, and your son got pulled over for speeding. Oops. And you are a deaf person who uses CART, and you want to be there to support your son. You're allowed to ask for a CART provider to be there, even though you didn't get the ticket. You're going to be there for your son. You're a person who is supporting your son. You're allowed to be there in court. You're allowed to ask for an interpreter. So the point is, it doesn't have to be the person who is actually the party of the case. It can be the family member. It can be a person who just wants to watch in court. If you're authorized to be there to observe, you can ask for an interpreter. Now, if you're not authorized to be there, you can't ask for an interpreter. But if it's an open court and you're allowed to be there, you have a right to effective communication. Okay, so again, this slide has a QR code. And if you snap that on your camera and download the QR code, will allow you to download a flyer that is a guide that has hyperlinks on it. And where the hyperlink underlines clerk of the court, that will take you to a web page where you can search for any clerk of the court, any clerk for any court in Virginia. So that will help you if at any point you need to search for a clerk of the court. There is a web page that will help you to be able to find any clerk of the court that you need to search for. Okay, so that flyer hopefully will be a good resource for you. Okay. I'm going to go ahead and advance. There are a couple of items on this slide, and I didn't realize that it kind of pops up bullets. So I think that's the only bullet, 2 bullets on that slide. And so when we're talking about K through 12 education, each school system is responsible for providing qualified interpreters for the students in the school system who need interpreters, but also for their parents. Okay. Or say for a grandparent who wants to come to a holiday party or pageant, right? So the school system is also responsible for providing interpreters for family members who are attending school-sponsored events of that kind. Okay. For those students who are in the school system who are deaf, hard of hearing, deaf, blind, those interpreters are labeled what's called a related service provider. And that's under the law that's called IDEA, Individuals with Disabilities Education Act. Okay. And so that interpreter might be listed as an accommodation on that student's individualized education plan or program, an IEP. Right. So that interpreting might be provided in the classroom, and it might also be provided for school-sponsored events. Right. So the point is the school system is responsible for getting the interpreters for those students. Looks like there was one more bullet there. So the ADA and Section 504 of the Rehabilitation Act also cover interpreting services in educational setting. So there are multiple laws that sort of impact interpreter provision in this school setting, K-12 school setting. Okay. So again, the school system is responsible for providing interpreters for parents as well as the students. So if a parent needs to appear for an IEP meeting with the teacher, for example, they should provide a qualified interpreter for that. And it should be at no cost to the parent, of course. Generally speaking, what I've seen is being most successful is for the parents to contact either the teacher or case manager who's responsible for that student's IEP, or the administrator of the building. There might be a special education coordinator in that building. If the county has an interpreter coordinator, that might be an individual that could be contacted to let them know that an interpreter is needed for a parent. So it may be that the parent would need to ask a little bit to find out who the best contact person would be for requesting interpreter services. But the school is responsible for getting an interpreter scheduled for those meetings. And then you would want to make them aware each time that you need to meet that an interpreter is needed. My advice would be never assume that they know that an interpreter is needed. I would ask each time that you schedule a meeting for interpreter services for each individual meeting. That kind of makes it less likely that it will be overlooked and less likely that you would show up for the meeting and find out that an interpreter was not thought about for the meeting. Okay. There are also times that I've seen that, the concern is that an interpreter who has been used in the classroom for a student is then pulled in to interpret for an IEP meeting that to provide services for a parent. That does happen, I think, fairly often, kind of unfortunately. And so that might be something that is a discussion to be had before the meeting occurs. If the parent feels that that is a conflict of interest, or if the parent feels that the particular interpreter is not a good fit for them and therefore would not provide effective communication, you would want to have that discussion with the school prior to the meeting. And if you feel that you need to ask for a different interpreter, a separate interpreter to be brought in or contracted for you, then you would want to express those concerns prior to the meeting happening. I can't, make comments on whether or not I feel that that would be successful or how difficult that conversation would be for you. But I do know that you would not want to wait until just, the day before. You would want to have that meeting or have that discussion with them in advance so that there would be time to make other arrangements if at all possible. Okay. So then there's the recognition that higher education is different than K-12. Okay, so I'll give you a second to look at this slide. So once a student graduates and they're no longer in K-12 education anymore, things are a little bit different as far as which laws apply, and which sort of guidance applies. But at the end of the day, institutes of higher education are still responsible for making sure that students are provided accommodations in order to access their curriculum. And you would want to make sure that if you are a person who needs accommodations, that you have made that clear by contacting the Office of Student Accommodation and filling out the proper paperwork that's involved in order to be able to validate the need for those accommodations. And those accommodations should be at no cost to the student. Okay. Contacting the Office of Student Accommodations or whatever that office is named at that particular college or university is where you would go to start that approval process. It varies how long that process would take. You would want to make sure that if you are a person who needs those accommodations, you make those needs known as soon as possible. And I would also expect that you would potentially need to file those papers potentially multiple times throughout your attendance at a college or university. Sometimes you would need to basically sort of renew your paperwork, sometimes regularly, sometimes rarely. It may vary. So I wouldn't be surprised if you would need to renew your paperwork as you attend over the course of various semesters. Usually accommodation requests like that are then made known to whatever teachers you have for the courses that you're going to that semester. And then the interpreter and the teacher and the student would work out how those logistics work best for them in the classroom. Okay. If you are an instructor in a college or university and you've never worked with an interpreter before, or you're a student just coming out of high school and you're not sure exactly how all of that works, the National Deaf Center on Post-Secondary Outcomes is a great resource, both for college personnel and for students. But also know that the Department of Aging and Rehabilitative Services here in Virginia, the state agency, does have a transition services available for students who are coming out of K-12. So you're graduating from high school, and pretty much interpreter services or accommodations have kind of been taken care of for you as a student, or, you know, for the most part, have been taken care of for you during your K-12 education. And maybe the student is not really sure exactly how to handle getting their own accommodations taken care of. Transition services at DARS can be helpful to a student. So if you're a parent of a student who uses interpreting in schools and they have not heard of transition services at DARS, I encourage you to contact transition services at the Department of Aging and Rehabilitative Services. They might be a good resource for you and your child who is transitioning into college age. Okay. So another setting, the last setting that we often get questions about is medical providers. Medical providers are responsible for getting interpreters for their patients in clinical settings. It should not be at any cost to the patient. Family members, people who have accompanied the patient, if they need interpreting services or accommodations, they should be provided them at no cost. And patients cannot be turned away because of their need for accommodations. So, you know, at the end of the day, medical providers, whether it be a doctor, a dentist, behavioral health facilities, treatment centers, they all have a responsibility to provide interpreting services if they're needed for effective communication, and they cannot turn a patient away simply because they need accommodations. It is not legal for them to do that. So the Department of Justice is very interested in this topic, by the way, and released what's called a Dear Colleague letter to the medical community last year as a way to remind them of their obligation. So the QR code that's in the corner here would allow you to download a flyer, again, that you could, if you're a consumer, you could download and print out and give to your medical provider. And it has hyperlinks and to information for them to be able to inform themselves about what their obligations are. And so hopefully they can be given enough resources that they can educate themselves about the fact that they should be providing interpreting services for their patients. Okay. And just as a parting shot, as far as tips for working with interpreters, I realized that I left my tips slide off when I handed these over to Bonnie. I wanted consumers just to remember that the more the interpreters know about your assignment, the better. So if you can give them just a summary of, you know, why are we here? What type of appointment is this? Oh, we're here for a well baby visit for my son today. If you can give them any, you know, acronyms that you think are going to be used. For instance, like I just did a few minutes ago, when I said DARS, I'm not going to assume that the interpreter knows what that means. And I'm going to say Department of Aging and Rehabilitative Services, so that I make sure that the interpreter understands what I mean. And that way I make sure that that message is effectively communicated to the person that I'm trying to have a conversation with. Okay. And names, for that matter, too, are very difficult for interpreters to be able to take in or to be able to convey accurately if they've never seen them or heard them before. So if a consumer can, make them as clear as possible to the interpreter, that can always be helpful to make sure that the message is conveyed clearly. And another tip I would say, as far as working well with an interpreter, to try and make sure that if you're a consumer and you're giving information about the assignment, try and make sure to give as much information about the actual location for your assignment as possible. You might give a street address, but if it's in a complex, for example, and there are building numbers, make sure to give the building number and make sure to give the room number and let them know, oh, by the way, there is a security checkpoint where you have to go through a metal detector, or there is there's a gatehouse where you have to stop and they're going to search your car, or, any type of logistical information that you can give the interpreter or the interpreter referral agency that they're working with. That's really helpful to them because they can add extra time in order to arrive early enough to locate the building you're in, instead of being lost inside of the complex, circling around, trying to figure out which building to go to. And it gives them a better chance of being able to arrive on time to your assignment and not be late for you. So those are just a couple of, minor logistical tips that I could give as far as actually working with an interpreter. There are many, many more types of tips that I could give as far as working with interpreters, but I know that we're running short and I want to give at least a few minutes to be able to ask questions. Let me go ahead and stop sharing here as well. My last slide is a contact us slide. And when Bonnie sends those, makes them available, my contact information is at the end there. I want to go ahead and stop sharing so that
Okay,
we're able to see the full screen.
stop recording.